3 months from now, the US will head to the polls in what could become one of the most consequential midterm elections in decades. On the surface, the story seems obvious. You have a president with weak approval ratings, a Congress that appears ready to turn against him, markets nervous about inflation, the Fed preparing for another difficult decision, and the world still trying to understand whether the US and Iran are moving towards peace, or simply pausing before the next confrontation. At first glance, these all look like separate stories: politics, economics, foreign policy, energy, but they're not. They're all connected, and together they reveal something much bigger happening inside Washington, D.C. Because something unusual is happening. Trump may be losing political support. Congress may be becoming more divided than ever. Washington, D.C. may become increasingly capable of passing major legislation, and yet the US could simultaneously become more powerful, not because Congress is stronger, but because the White House will be. Most people think political power works like a scoreboard. Win elections, gain power; lose elections, lose power. Simple. Except that's not really how the American political system works, because there are actually two different kinds of power. There is the power to make laws, and there is the power to act. Those are not the same things, and over the past 20 years, they've increasingly drifted apart. Think about the biggest geopolitical events of the past decade: sanctions on Russia, tariffs on China, military strikes in Syria, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, sanctions on Iran, and even the recent confrontation with Iran. Most of these decisions were not made by Congress. They were made inside the White House. Increasingly, that's where markets move. That helps explain something that initially sounds almost impossible. Even if Donald Trump loses political capital this November, he will still retain extraordinary influence over the issues that matter most to financial markets: trade, tariffs, foreign policy, sanctions, military deployments. Congress can make governing harder, but cannot easily take away those powers of Trump. And that's why the 2026 midterms may tell a very different story from the ones most headlines are describing. For months, political discussion has focused almost entirely on one question: will Republicans lose the House? It's an important question, but it may not be the right one. A better question is this: what happens when Congress becomes weaker while the presidency stays remarkably powerful? That is the story unfolding right now. To understand why, we have to start with something that surprises everyone: Trump's approval ratings. Because although they're historically weak, they don't tell the entire story. In fact, they may be causing some of us to underestimate what's about to happen next. Let's start with Chapter 1. The midterms are not about Congress. When people think about American politics, the building is usually where they imagine power lives: the United States Capitol. 435 members of the House, 100 senators, thousands of staff, hundreds of committees. It's where laws are written, budgets are announced, wars are authorized, presidents are changed. Well, at least that's a theory. For most of the 20th century, that theory largely held. Presidents proposed, Congress decided, big moments in American history, the Civil Rights Act, Social Security, were all products of legislative compromise. Power flowed through Congress. But modern Washington, D.C. doesn't quite work the same way. Over the past 2 decades, Congress has become remarkably bad at doing the things it was destined to do: pass legislation. The reasons are complicated. There is political polarization, primary elections, media fragmentation, social media, but the outcome is surprisingly simple. Congress has become increasingly difficult to govern. And here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Most people assume that when Congress becomes weaker, the president becomes weaker too. But that has not happened. Instead, something almost paradoxical occurred. As Congress became less capable of acting, the president simply began acting without it. This is executive orders, emergency declarations, national security powers. Over time, the center of gravity in Washington quietly shifted, not because the Constitution changed, but because politics did. That distinction is becoming incredibly important, because if some analysts are correct, the US is about to enter another period of divided government. Democrats are increasingly favored to regain the House. The Senate remains much closer, which outcome is not guaranteed. But the base case amongst many political forecasters is a split Congress. At first glance, that sounds like paralysis. But paralysis for whom? Congress may struggle to pass major legislation, but foreign governments don't negotiate with Congress. Oil producers don't wait for congressional committees. Financial markets don't react to committee hearings. Iranian negotiators don't talk to Congress. When sanctions are imposed, when military deployments change, those decisions increasingly originate somewhere else. That's why the next 2 years could feel strangely contradictory. Washington may look dysfunctional, and yet its influence on global markets and the world may remain just as powerful, perhaps even more so. This isn't unprecedented. Think back over the past decade. The trade war with China, sanctions on Russia, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, the recent negotiations of the Strait of Hormuz. Some of those decisions involved Congress. Many did not. Markets responded anyway, because investors were not asking, what did Congress vote for? They were always asking, what will the president do? And that's why the 2026 midterms matter. Not because they will suddenly transform American foreign policy, but because they transform how foreign policy gets made. A divided Congress leaves fewer opportunities for sweeping domestic reforms, healthcare, immigration, climate. All of this becomes harder. So where does the White House focus instead? On the areas where it already possesses broad authority: trade, diplomacy, national security, sanctions, military posture. Exactly the issues that increasingly determine commodity prices, shipping routes, energy markets. So, geopolitical risk is the big one, and that brings us back to Donald Trump. Many commentators describe him entering the weakest phase of his presidency. Politically, they may be right, but politically weaker doesn't necessarily mean strategically weaker. Those are completely different things. One measures popularity, the other measures authority, and authority can survive political decline. Sometimes it even grows because the alternatives become less effective. But if the White House is becoming more powerful, what exactly is it going to do with that power? To answer that, we have to leave Washington and travel nearly 7,000 miles away to the Strait of Hormuz. So let's go to chapter 2, why the Iran conflict changed everything. There are very few places on earth where geography can change global politics, and the Strait of Hormuz is one of them. Every day, roughly a fifth of the world's internationally traded oil and gas pass through the stretch of water. No matter how tense relations become, the strait would always remain open. That was the assumption, and that assumption didn't survive 2026. When conflict erupted earlier this year, the world's attention immediately shifted to one question: would the US respond with overwhelming military force? For decades, that would have been the expected answer. American naval power has dominated the Middle East since the end of the Cold War. Freedom of navigation was just not a policy. It became part of the international system. But something unexpected happened. The US hesitated. not because it lacked military capability, but because it began asking a different question. Not can we reopen the Hormuz, but can we reopen the Hormuz without another war? For weeks, markets assumed the crisis would follow a familiar pattern: escalation, retaliation, more escalation. Instead, almost overnight, the conversation changed. Military briefings became diplomatic briefings. The question was no longer how to defeat Iran, it was how to negotiate with it. This simply wasn't about the Middle East. It revealed something much bigger. Who actually controls American foreign policy? It's not the Congress, it's not the Senate. The negotiations were happening almost entirely inside the executive branch, the White House, the State Department, the Pentagon. Exactly the institutions that remained largely unaffected by a divided Congress. And that's why the timing matters. The Democrats may regain the House. Congress will almost certainly become even more divided. Passing major domestic legislation will become even more harder. But none of that changes who negotiates with Iran or China or Ukraine or Russia. Those powers already belong to Trump. The Hormuz crisis also exposes another reality. Military power has limits. The US possesses the world's most powerful navy, and yet none of those advantages automatically reopen a shipping lane once commercial insurers refuse to insure vessels. Power is not just about firepower. It is also about confidence, insurance markets, shipping companies, commodity traders, diplomacy. Sometimes those determine outcomes just as much as missiles do. That's why the recent diplomatic push matters. Whether the negotiations ultimately succeed or fail, they represent a strategic shift. Washington increasingly appears to recognize that military superiority alone cannot solve every geopolitical problem. Sometimes the objective is not victory, it's stability, not permanent peace, just enough predictability for global trade to function. That doesn't mean the crisis is over. Far from it. Any agreement reached today could unravel tomorrow. But something fundamental has changed. The objective. The conversation has moved from escalation to management. If you've been watching carefully, you may have noticed something very peculiar. Everything we've discussed so far, Congress, Iran, executive power, has one thing in common. It's the markets. Because every major decision we've looked at eventually shows up somewhere else. In oil prices, shipping costs, inflation. And that brings us perhaps to the most important institution in this entire story. One that doesn't report to Congress. One that doesn't report to the White House. One that can dramatically reshape the economy with a single decision. That is the Federal Reserve. So let's go to chapter 3. This is the institution that doesn't need an election. We spent about the last 10 minutes talking about political power, Congress, the White House, executive orders, foreign policy. But there's the other institution in Washington, one that almost never appears in any campaign ads, one that doesn't stand for elections, one that doesn't campaign, it doesn't debate, it doesn't tweet, and yet it can move trillions of dollars with a single sentence. The Fed. If Congress represents democratic power and the White House represents executive power, then the Fed represents something very different, technocratic power. Its job is not to win elections. Its job is to ignore them. At least that's the theory. The Fed has one of the hardest jobs in government. Raise interest rates too much, you risk recession. Lower them too quickly, then inflation comes roaring back. There are no perfect choices, only trade-offs. And unlike politicians, central bankers don't get rewarded for making people happy. They keep getting rewarded for keeping the economy stable. That independence wasn't created by accident. It evolved over generations because politicians naturally want to get stronger growth before elections. They're designed to think beyond the next election cycles. That is the Fed. Which brings us to today. The White House wants lower interest rates. Businesses want cheaper borrowing. Homeowners want lower mortgage payments. Financial markets have spent months hoping the next move will be a cut. But the Federal Reserve is looking at a different set of numbers. Inflation, wage growth, consumer spending. And those numbers tell a more complicated story. The American economy hasn't behaved the way people expected. Despite geopolitical tensions, higher energy prices, and tighter financial conditions, consumers are still spending, businesses are still investing. Employment has remained surprisingly strong. Normally, that would be good news, but for a central bank trying to reduce inflation, strong growth creates a dilemma. If the economy refuses to slow, inflation may refuse to disappear. That's why something unusual has happened over the past few weeks. Markets have gradually begun asking a question that barely seemed possible earlier this summer. It was not, when will the Federal Reserve cut rates? But the question is, could it actually raise them again? That possibility has quietly become one of the most biggest risks facing financial markets. Not because another increase would necessarily be large, but because of its timing. The calendar suddenly matters. Late August, central bankers gather at Jackson Hole in Wyoming, one of the most closely watched economic meetings in the world. Then September, the Fed meets again, and after that, the political calendar takes over. The closer America moves towards the election, the harder every monetary decision becomes. Not because the economics change, but because perceptions do. This is where our story comes full circle. Remember what we discussed earlier. A divided Congress doesn't necessarily weaken the presidency, but it also doesn't strengthen it enough to control everything. The Fed remains one of the few major institutions that can still say no. No to markets, no to investors, no to politicians, even no to the president. And that's why September could become so important, not because of interest rates, but because it reveals something much larger, how independent America's institutions are. For all the discussions about elections, presidents, Congress, and Trump, there are still limits to executive power, and perhaps nowhere are those limits more visible than inside a room where 12 central bankers quietly vote, while the rest of the world waits outside. Let's move to chapter 4. What if you've been watching the wrong story? Let's go back to where we started, the midterm elections. On the surface, it looks like a story about politics. Republicans trying to defend Congress, Democrats trying to win it back. Campaign speeches, polling, attack ads, fundraising, the normal rhythm of American democracy. But if we've learned anything of the past 20 minutes, it's that this election may be telling a very different story. Not about who wins, but about where power lies. For most of American history, Congress sat at the center of political life. It debated, it compromised, passed legislation. The presidency carried out those decisions. But today, that relationship feels different. Congress still possesses enormous constitutional authority, but politically it's becoming increasingly difficult for it to exercise that authority. Polarization hasn't weakened the Constitution, it's weakened cooperation, and that changes everything. Here's what's fascinating. This is not about Donald Trump, nor is it unique to Republicans. The expansion of executive authority has been happening for decades. Every president inherits powers, uses them, and leaves them slightly stronger than before. The presidency has become the institution that acts, while Congress increasingly becomes the institution that reacts. That's not a constitutional revolution, it's a political one. And nowhere is that more obvious than in foreign policy. Think about the stories we've just spoken about. Negotiations with Iran, tariffs on China, sanctions, military stature, diplomatic agreements. Markets respond almost instantly. Oil moves, currency moves, shipping costs change, governments react. Yet, Congress often enters a conversation only later, if at all. That's why the Hormuz crisis matters, not because of energy markets, but because it demonstrated how modern American power increasingly works. Military force became diplomatic leverage. Executive authority became negotiation. Markets adjusted, but Congress watched. The Fed tells a similar story. It reminds us that power in America isn't concentrated in one institution. It's distributed. The White House wants growth. The Fed wants stability. Congress wants compromise. But markets need certainty. These objectives will never align. And when they don't, the tension itself becomes the story. That's an important distinction, because political commentary often treats Washington like a chessboard. One side wins and the other side loses. But in reality, it's a lot more messier. It's a system where power doesn't disappear. It moves, sometimes quietly, sometimes so gradually that we don't notice until years later. The coming months will almost certainly produce dramatic headlines. The Fed may surprise markets. The House will probably change hands. Negotiations with Iran could succeed or collapse. Energy prices may rise or fall. Every one of those stories will dominate the news cycle for a few days. Then another headline will replace it. But underneath those headlines, a slower story continues, one that is much harder to see. America isn't simply changing governments. It's changing how governments work. Power is gradually becoming more concentrated inside institutions that can move faster than Congress. Sometimes that's efficient, but sometimes it's dangerous. Usually it's both. And perhaps that's the real story from this year's midterms. The election in November isn't deciding whether America becomes more or less powerful, more blue or more red. It's deciding which institutions will exercise that power. History looks obvious. Once it's over, the Berlin Wall, the financial crisis, Brexit, COVID, at the time, they felt like isolated events. Only later did they reveal themselves as part of something much larger. Perhaps the same will be true of the midterm elections this November. Years from now, people may not remember individual campaign ads, or polling averages, or Senate races. They may remember something else. This was the moment when the center of gravity inside American government quietly shifted once again. Because in the end, the most important political question is not who wins the next election. The most important question is who still has the power to act after the election is over. And that may be the question that shapes not only the next presidency, but the next decade of global politics.